So the key is for me to stand up on stage as little as possible and to get to our speakers, because that's why you guys are here. And so I want to introduce, for those that have been here before, we start with an MIT professor. We really try to deliver the knowledge from the Institute. And I've been chasing this guy to show up here for years. He actually told me it's his first time at the Newton Marriott, which just sort of says a little bit about the MIT professor mind. So Nelson Repenning, I feel like he's lived at MIT. He got his PhD at MIT. He spent the last 30 years here. He has filled a variety of roles: associate dean at Sloan, the business school, the head of the systems dynamics department. But I found out something last week. The internet is a marvelous thing. I found out that he's the only MIT professor that owns a family mulching business. MIT and mulching, who knew? But it all comes together in that who knows how to smell bullshit and call bullshit in their organizations? It's the CFO. And you know who knows how to smell bullshit as well? It's Nelson Repenning. And what is really special about if you Google him, he's run an unbelievable book. This title is magical. There's got to be a better way. I feel like I say this to my son every single day. There's got to be a better way. And he's going to share some of the wisdom from these pages. It's pretty special. I think it's going to resonate with all of you, all of the CFOs out there. And so let's get today started. Nelson, come on up.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. As Jeremy said, so first off, where you were going with the bullshit, you said, I'm good at smelling it. I was worried that shoveling was going to be brought into evidence. But exactly as Jeremy said, I'm an MIT lifer. I showed up on my 23rd birthday. That was in 1991, and have been there ever since, other than a leave of absence to work just for 1 year for an energy company. And actually, as I think befits many MIT faculty members, I've only really worked on one problem for that entire 35 years. And that problem is, why don't organizations like yours use the tools and the processes that we would all agree are good things to do? So what I have really focused on is, to use the academic jargon, the problem of implementation, right? So once you have decided to do something, right, new tool, new process, new technology, how is it that you can insert it into your organization in a way that will maximize the chance that your organization actually uses that? Okay? And I need to tell you that the track record for large organizations on implementation is actually pretty bad. I cut my teeth many, many years ago with the sort of lean-related tools that came from the Asian manufacturers. I spent 10 years working in high-hazard industries on safety-related tools. I've done work in hospitals. I've done work on technology. And basically, what you find in looking at a wide range of data, and this comes from many researchers, not just me, is that the track record of established organizations in doing new things is abysmally bad. Okay? Established organizations are remarkably inertial beasts, meaning that what they do today tends to look a lot like what they did yesterday, and getting them to do new things, particularly if you've had a track record of success, is not easy. Okay? That said, there are a subset of those that have a very different track record. There are outliers that are actually quite able to pull new ideas towards them and use them in an effective way, and as a consequence experience sort of dramatic competitive advantage over their peers that struggle more. And so I have this new book out that Jeremy nicely alluded to, There's Got to Be a Better Way, and it's really my and my co-author Don Kiefer's answer to this question, which is, how can you configure yourself? How can you think about organizational change so any new idea or tool or process that is out there, you can bring it into your organization in a way that it's actually going to generate competitive advantage? Okay? Now, given the sort of current environment, as an MIT faculty member, I just signed my next contract for this year, and part of that contract is I have to put the words A and I together at least once every half hour during all my waking hours. So the second half today is we're going to talk about a specific example of this implementation challenge, which is how do we use AI so that it can be effective? And I know that every executive team is probably facing pressure from their boards at the moment to have some sense of what their AI strategy is and how they're going to take advantage of what is obviously going to be a sort of dramatic and disruptive change to the way that we think about our organization. So let me give you a quick overview of the book and some of the key ideas that have come out of now multiple decades worth of research. And then Jason will come up and we'll talk a little bit about the specific manifestations for artificial intelligence and its sort of variant technologies. So where our research starts and what we have come to, the implementation challenge really starts with quotes that look like this. And if you have read some of my earlier work, a lot of what I focused on is trying to explain this phenomenon that goes under a variety of different names, whether it's firefighting or whack-a-mole or whatever it is. But the basic idea is that in all the organizations that we have studied now over many years, one of the things that we find over and over again is that for many of you, on most days, it feels like your organization is managing you rather than you are managing it. Right? And if you think about the sort of gist of this quote, and I imagine it looks pretty familiar to most of you, is we show up Monday morning with the best of intentions. We're going to use the new tools. We're going to use the new processes. We're going to execute our strategy. And yet, somehow, something conspires over the course of the week that when we get back to the office on Friday afternoon, we did not make any progress on those intentions. Right? So, show of hands, does this look familiar to most of you? Right? I'd be shocked if it didn't. And so, what we tried to do is we have sort of two pieces, which is a diagnosis, which I'll share with you in just a moment, and then I have a couple solutions that I want to leave you with, and I'm happy to chat with any of you sort of offline. Okay? But here is the sort of core idea of the book, okay? Which is, if you dig back into the history of the modern corporation and the processes that many of you execute on a daily basis, most of what we do in large established organizations, most of the processes we execute is implicitly premised on the notion that we can forecast the future with some degree of accuracy and that we can forecast our impact on that future with some degree of accuracy. Okay? Right? If you think about your budgeting processes, which I know are near and dear to the hearts of all the people in this room, your technology roadmaps, your strategies, right, all of those have embodied in them, right, an implicit presumption that we have some sense of what the world is going to be like for the next 12 months or 5 years or whatever it's going to be, okay? Right, so there is a forecast of the future and a presumed accuracy embodied in those, okay? So to use the academic jargon, right, we are assuming that the world is essentially static. It's not going to change that much, right? But as Jeremy alluded to, right, we all know that's not true. Right? If you pick up any business periodical, right, Fortune, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, or whatever, right, the first line in at least half the articles in that magazine is, the world is changing faster than it ever has before. Okay? Now, I don't actually know whether that's true. I'm guessing in 1850 it felt like the world was changing pretty fast then. But nonetheless, you were all facing a dramatic degree of change. And, you know, it is sort of the topic of conferences like this and almost everything that's written today. And so, right, what happens when we take essentially static processes, right, and we use them to try to manage a fundamentally dynamic world? Okay? Well, what happens is that pretty quickly, because the world is changing so rapidly, right, what you have assumed that goes into your planning and your budgeting, your strategy, no longer matches the world that you are trying to exist in. And then what happens is that all the people who work for you, because they are smart, they are talented, they are well-intentioned, what they do is they work around those processes so that they can still deliver what you ask them to do. And that is where the trouble starts. Okay? Let me give you a concrete example of this that I think will resonate pretty strongly with this audience, and it's one I use all the time when I talk about this. I want you to think for a second, in your companies, how long is budget season? And what I mean by that is from the day the budget goes into effect, right, how many months in advance do you start the planning and the negotiating and the horse trading that leads to that budget? Okay? Let's do a show of hands. How many of you, your budget season's at least 3 months? Okay, most of you. How about 6 months? Okay, so about half the room, a little bit hard to see it start. Right, when I ask this to our exec ed audiences, the median answer is typically about 6 months. Right? So if you have a July 1 fiscal year, somewhere around January, so it'll be pretty soon, you're going to start the negotiations and the horse trading. Right? And then the second question I often ask is, and then exactly to the point Jeremy made earlier, how long are the assumptions in that budget relevant enough that it is a useful guide for action over the course of the year? Right? And the average answer I get there is typically about 3 months, right? A little bit industry specific. But think about the mismatch between those two, right? In many cases, you are spent twice as much time creating the plan as you are actually using it. And then what happens in the remaining 9 months of the year is all the smart, talented people who work for you get out their duct tape and their safety pins and their chewing gum, and they make it look like they are meeting that plan, even though the world is no longer different, right? And I don't imagine I have to spend a lot of time convincing this room is the pathologies that are associated with those workarounds where making it look like I'm following the plan when in fact under the waterline I am not, are very well understood, whether it's meeting sales targets or changing R&D programs on the fly or whatever it might be. And the reason that these workarounds are so problematic is really twofold, right? Number one, and this goes back to a lot of research I've done, is that in most cases when people work around the process, those workarounds tend to emphasize short-run results at the expense of long-run investments and long-run capability. So if you look at my graph on the, can you not see my slides? There we go. I can see them up here, but it's not doing you all much good. Is that when people do those workarounds, they tend very much to have this kind of better before worse flavor, which is that they solve the problem in the short run, but they almost always create bigger problems in the long run. So it's setting your organization up for bigger problems in the future. And then on top of that, because those workarounds tend to be private, right? It's things that I do on the side, right? It tends to also create a large number of coordination problems, right? One of the places that I see this all the time, I've spent a lot of time studying research and development processes, and what you will see is that when the world changes, people will often tear up their technology roadmaps and R&D portfolios. They'll insert projects at the last minute. There'll be a huge amount of firefighting that goes to get that project done, but that firefighting almost always leaves a huge set of problems that are going to have to be fixed next year because now we haven't done the investments in the core capabilities we need. Often testing gets skimped upon, so we have things that we need to fix in the field, and the problem tends to feed on itself. So the core idea from our work really boils down to that if you presume the world is static when in fact it is dynamic, you are setting yourself up for departures from your standard plans, and that tends to reinforce this kind of vicious cycle that drives you into the firefighting mode that I talked about earlier, right? And that is basically an extremely effective recipe for creating a system that is managing you rather than you feel like you are managing it. And let me just give you one example of this because I think it will connect to a topic that's near and dear to your collective hearts. One of the companies that I worked with pretty extensively, and it's actually where my co-author came from early in my career, was Harley Davidson. They had this problem endemically in their R&D environment. It was complete chaos. They never knew which projects were going to get to launch until the last few minutes. It was really a big headache, cost them an enormous amount of money. But one of the things that my students and I noticed is there were a few project managers that were never late. Come hell or high water, they always got their projects done. Right? They were able to run the gauntlet of all the chaos in the organization much better than their peers. And so that led to a really interesting question for us, which is, well, what makes a good firefighter? Right? Why is it there are some people that can sort of get through this chaos much better than others? And I imagine all of you are picturing the equivalent of that person in your organization right now, which is that one person that somehow always gets their work done no matter what. Long story short, what we learned is what made a good firefighter is they had a better social network to the scarce resources they needed to get their work done. Right? So they might go over to the test lab and say, hey, I know my project's not the #1 priority, but hey, we go deer hunting together in the fall, and you're the godparents to my kids. When you just do this quick test for me because I'm a little bit behind, right? And they'd go to the structures lab and the marketing team and so on and so forth. And they were very good at pulling resources towards them in order to get things done. Seems great, except that if you follow this story, who's now determining the strategy of Harley-Davidson, which is really manifested in the products that they release every year? It's not the product planning committee, right? It's not the senior executive team. It is the social network of the people who are executing the work. Right? And so one of the major costs of falling into this mode is senior executive teams, at least in our experience, very much lose control of their ability to guide their organization, creating a very acute version of this problem of the system is managing them
rather than they are managing it. So, what do you do about it? So in the book, we describe a methodology that my colleague Don and I have developed that we call dynamic work design. And basically what we have is a set of design rules for helping you rethink some of the core processes in your organization to make them a little bit more flexible and a little bit more adaptable. Okay? Now, budgets and strategies and HR plans and capital plans, those aren't going away, right? Those are sort of core to making your organization work. But what we have found is that if you can complement those with a little bit more of an adaptable or dynamic way of thinking, you can get actually some surprisingly dramatic results in terms of improving the performance of your organization. And I will show you an example of this in just a moment. So our experience is that just inserting a little bit of dynamism into your core processes can create some dramatic gains in the performance of your organization. So what are these principles? And they're all described in detail in the book, so I can go through them fairly quickly, and happy to chat with you at the break if that's helpful. But the first of these is what we call solve the right problem. And the idea here is extremely simple, which is that if you believe that we are in a world that we can't perfectly predict, right, what is going to happen on a regular basis is your organization, the way it's configured, your strategy, is going to be mismatched to what the environment requires, right? You are not going to be delivering the products or the services that your customers necessarily need. In that world, your ability as an organization to recognize that problem and solve it quickly and effectively is an absolutely core skill. So the first principle is really just a charge to raise your game around making sure that your organization kind of has its act together in terms of being an effective and structured problem solving. And the nice thing here is all of you already have training in this. This is basically the scientific method you learned in the 6th or 7th grade. So in most cases, this is just returning to probably your roots and making sure that you use those tools on a regular basis. Okay? Second principle is what we call structure for discovery. And again, the basic idea here is pretty straightforward. I grew up as an academic at the birth of the organizational learning movement. So many of you probably have chief learning officers. Some of you may have training centers, and I'm sure you spend quite a bit of money in terms of organizational learning. It is a topic that has become, I think, ubiquitous in most organizations. But the insight that has popped out of our research is there is no training course, no matter how long or how well executed, that can offset what your folks are learning on their jobs on a day-to-day basis. Okay? Right? We're going to talk about AI and large language models in just a moment, but where those came from, right? They're models of what actually happens in our head. Right? The folks, your people out there who are doing the work, they are learning every day about the right and wrong ways to do their job, and it's a fundamental feature of our cognition that you can't turn it off. But most of the work that we ask people to do, particularly on the front lines, is so poorly designed that it's almost guaranteed they are going to learn the wrong lessons about how to execute that work. And so often, just a simple sort of review of that and thinking carefully about what feedback did they get back from those jobs can lead to major gains in terms of how the folks on the front lines execute the work on a day-to-day basis. Okay? Third principle is what we call connect the human chain. This is a very rich one. I won't sort of drag you through all the details, but let me give you just a little teaser of what's embodied in this principle, and that is what our research suggests is that in most of your organizations, you are using email and face-to-face meetings in almost exactly the opposite way to what would be optimal. Okay? So think about this. How many of you have been to a strategy launch meeting? We're going to do something new on our organizations. It's 55 minutes of slides, one softball question at the end, and then you go in the hallway and your head's spinning around because everything you've been planning is now different. What do? You start with hallway conversations and Slack messages and text messages and emails at night to try to process all the change and ambiguity that has now followed that new strategy. Okay? You'd be hard-pressed to come up with a worse way to execute that process. Okay? What is face-to-face communication good for? It is good for processing ambiguity. So when you're doing new things and you're making change, the most efficient way to manage that is to get people in the room and discuss it rather than sort of go back and forth on email or whatever, right? Be much better to send out the slides in advance and use that 55 minutes to talk about what are we going to have to do differently as a consequence, okay? This is an example of the connect the human chain, which basically the idea behind this principle is How do we take full advantage of what is one of your most scarce resources, which is face-to-face human communication? Many of you are probably now in a remote world, and this principle is even more important than it was once before because we no longer get those random interactions in the hallway and the lunch line that we used to get when we were all co-located. As a side note, this is actually a big problem on the Institute right now because many of our innovations started at lunch or coffee or whatever, and those don't happen anymore because we're not on campus as much. And so it has now become a much more acute design problem to make sure that we have some of those random interactions. Okay? Fourth principle is what we call regulate for flow. The idea here is simply almost all of you take on too much work, which many of you probably think is a good thing because it makes sure that all your folks are busy all the time. Turns out it doesn't work that way, right? For many of you, your technology development portfolios, your R&D portfolios, your product development portfolios look like the highway between Boston and Cape Cod on Friday afternoon in the summer. Okay? When you take on too much work, productivity tends to grind to a halt. There's a whole host of costs that are associated with that. And it turns out, particularly with the theme of this conference, is when you overload your organization, you are basically completely eliminating your ability to adapt, right? And pretty soon, everything becomes a special case. And so in the book, we give quite a bit of guidance about how to think about what is the right amount of work to put into your core processes so that you get stuff done, which is obviously very important, but you have the ability to redirect as the world inevitably changes. Okay? And then the last principle is what we call visualize the work. And this is particularly relevant to this audience. One of the insights that my co-author and I had, and he's a manufacturing guy, he started on the shop floor at Harley, is that, and it's kind of obvious ex post, although it took us a while to figure this out, is that when we started thinking about work design, particularly for knowledge workers like everyone in this room, one of the things we realized is most of the major innovations in work design in the last 70 years have come in the domain of physical work and mostly in factories. Right? So if you think about Lean, Six Sigma, the quality movement, and all the associated things, all of that stuff is focused on what happens in manufacturing and assembly, and about the only major innovation in probably the last 100 years in the way that knowledge work is executed is probably the agile method in software development. In retrospect, this is actually relatively easy to understand. Designing effective physical work is a lot easier, and it's easier for a very specific reason, which is physical work tends to give you clear signals when stuff is going wrong. Right? So if you think about an assembly line, we're making Toyota Camrys or whatever, it's moving along, we're bolting wheels on or whatever it might be. When that assembly line stops, right, because something broke, we get a clear signal something's wrong, and if you're the supervisor or the plant manager, you're probably going to walk over to the site of the stoppage and see if you can get the work going again. Okay? Contrast that with knowledge work, and let me scare you all a little bit. Right? While you're sitting in this room, I can guarantee you that if for at least one of you at this very moment while I'm speaking, right, someone in your organization who's doing something important is stuck. Right? Their work has stopped. Right? They don't know an answer to a particular question. They don't know whether this is a risk that you want to take. They don't know if this is okay with someone else in the organization. But just ask yourselves, when are you going to find out about it? Right? Because knowledge work does not give us that clear visual signal that something's gone wrong. Right? Now, maybe they'll take their phone out and they'll text you and you'll check it in the break. That'd be pretty good. But it turns out here you're a little bit fighting the psychology, because people don't like to tell the boss when they can't get their work done, right? And so here's something that we find in our research over and over again. I get stuck and I think to myself, you know, I don't really want to tell my boss that I can't get this project done or I need help, but I bet if I just think about it for a couple hours, I can solve it myself, right? And then when the end of the day rolls around and they still haven't solved the problem, now actually the problem's worse because A, they haven't solved the problem, and B, they really should have told you this morning, but they didn't want to. So what do they think? I'm sure if I just sleep on it, I'll have an insight, right? And one of the things that you find over and over again is in knowledge work, really important pieces of information about problems, right, are often only revealed to the people who can take advantage of it days, weeks, or even months later, right? And this makes your lives much more difficult. Okay? The basic idea behind the visualize the work principle is that we have had enormously good luck with when we can give knowledge work some kind of visual manifestation so that we can see it move through your organization or see when it's not moving, it becomes much easier to manage, right? And so I want you to think, this is an analogy my co-author created, right? Think about the process of managing airline traffic, right? Planes flying around, right? It'd be pretty hard to manage the flow of planes into Logan Airport if we had to do that with Excel spreadsheets, right? You know, if you got an Excel spreadsheet that had the location and the speed and the position, even if it was updated in real time, right, our brains would probably not be able to process that information in a useful way. And fortunately, that's not what we do, right? We have a radar screen, we can see the position, we get a visual sense of where they are. The idea behind Visualize the Work is very similar, right? And sometimes with the simplest of technology, when we create simple representations so you can see the core tasks moving through your organization, when they're moving and when they're not, you can manage that stuff far more effectively because now you get visual signals when things are going well and when they're going not. Okay? Now, let me show you just one project. The book has very much narrative driven, and we've got dozens of projects that we describe. This one is extremely simple, but it's one of my favorites because I think it really captures the essence of what this method can offer. So the client organization here is Standard Chartered Bank, which at the time, the chief operating officer, David Whiting, was a student who had taken one of our classes. And as part of his role as COO, this probably will look pretty familiar to you, his office was responsible for signing off on the risk profile of all the IT projects that the bank was doing, right? And if you dig into the basic mechanics of this, right, he had 16 risk experts. So you got cybersecurity and data privacy and so on and so forth. And each of those people was supposed to look at their IT development projects, make sure that they were risk appropriate before they could go into the development phase, right? Pretty straightforward and a pretty normal process that almost all of you probably have some variant of this, okay? At the outset, average time for just this part, this is sign-off, not actually development, was 120 days. And David's big insight is he said, I realized that this process was gated by the risk owner who thought the project was least important. Right? Put yourselves in the shoes of a project manager, right? You've got to run this gauntlet of these 16 risk experts, so you're basically chasing 16 people around, right? If the risk in your project is very relevant to a particular risk owner, okay, they'll probably meet with you, right? But if it's not relevant to a particular risk owner, right, then you're going to be trading emails and going back and forth, and it's going to take a long time to get their attention. And God forbid that one risk owner requests a change, which then another risk owner has to sign off on, because now you are into a really difficult game of shuttle diplomacy as you're going back and forth between all these folks, okay? This is an enormously bad dynamic design. Right? Because what's happening here is you're trying to create a process that will adapt to the inputs of a bunch of different skilled technical experts, but unbeknownst to them, until David showed up, they're doing it in essentially the least efficient way that they could possibly do it. Okay? So David's intervention could not have been simpler. He instituted a week-long meeting with the project managers and the risk owners, and that meeting was guided by what he calls a common backlog, which is just a fancy name for a flip chart that had all the projects they were reviewing, and those projects were rank ordered. This one's the most important, this one's the second most important, this one's the third most important, and so on. And what would they do during that hour? We're going to work on the first project till it's done, then we're going to move on to the second one. That's it. Okay? That simple intervention, right, they were able to reduce their approval time from 100 days to 20, and by Standard Charter's own internal metrics, save them $250 million annually. Right? And the reason this works is it's a combo of the connect the human chain principle, right? Rather than doing all this horse trading by email individual meetings, let's have a face-to-face meeting so that we can process this ambiguous information quickly. And the role of the common backlog is essentially a regulate the flow idea, which is let's not spread our resources a bunch of different things, right? Let's just focus on the most important thing till it's done and then move on to the next, okay? Enormously successful with essentially zero technology. There's an interesting coda to this, which is when David first put this in, he took some crap from his colleagues because he said, well, this is an awfully expensive meeting, David. We pay these risk owners a lot of money. And to have them all together in a meeting, right, that's pretty expensive, right? Now, I don't know how much risk analysts make, but I'm pretty sure if you multiply it by 16, you don't get to $250 million a year, right? So in many cases, a better dynamic work design will feel a little bit counterintuitive until you have experienced it. And again, this is a very simple project. We have sort of more sophisticated ones. But the second to last thought that I will leave you with is that you have thousands of opportunities like this in all of your organizations. Okay? It probably does not feel like it because you have lived in the environment you've been in now probably for many years. But I promise you, if you can step back and think a little bit differently, at least based on our empirical experience, there is not even low-hanging fruit, but fruit that you are tripping over as you're trying to get your work done over the course of the day. And there is enormous upside to, at least in our experience, to thinking a little bit differently. Okay, one final thought, and then we'll get Jason up here. And I want to connect it and, again, fulfill my contractual obligation to say AI at least once a half hour. As I've been talking about the book, no big surprise, the question of, well, how does work design connect to artificial intelligence comes up over and over again. And I want to leave you with just a sort of cautionary tale. And some of you, if you are my age or a little older, may remember this, which is in the 1980s, as the Asian car manufacturers were rising in prominence, General Motors in particular decided that they were going to solve their competitive problems with automation. Right? And GM, Roger Smith, got up and said, we're going to build essentially lights-out factories. We're going to replace all those pesky human beings with robots, and that is going to be our path to competitive success. Estimates of how much they spent differs a little bit, but it is somewhere on the order of $50 to $90 billion. Okay? And this is 1980 billion, so this is an enormous amount of money back then. Okay? Total disaster. Robot factories were never able to equal the human-centered factories in terms of productivity. And if you go back and look, there's all sorts of funny stories of the robots spending more time painting each other and welding the car doors shut and so on and so forth. Was by any measure a major disaster. And just to give you a sense of how big it was, I went back and as I did some research, in 1986, their former CEO wrote that for the money that they had spent on automation, GM probably could have bought either Toyota or Nissan, right? Imagine the difference that we would have the world today if that had happened, right? This industry would have evolved entirely differently. That's maybe something we can talk about at the break. But here's the thing that I want to leave you with. You go to any major factory today, there are robots everywhere, right? So Smith didn't have the wrong idea, right? Automation was going to be a major component of manufacturing and assembly. The problem is the strategy he chose to get from point A to point B, right? Trying to do it all at once, at least in this context, was a very bad choice. Toyota, in contrast, went much more incrementally. And I think one of the things that we can talk about as we go forward is as you think about adding AI and its variants to your work, right? I think right now, as at least I read the popular media, there is a big push for everywhere all at once. I will say, as someone who's studied implementation his whole life, that makes me a little nervous. Right? I have no question that if we have this meeting 10 years from now, AI will have changed the world in ways we couldn't possibly anticipate. The question is only which strategies are going to get your companies to that endpoint faster. Okay? So with that, let's shift gears, and maybe Jason and I can talk a little bit about this. So, Jeremy.